Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial video. This is Abdel from Grandstream support. In today's video we will talk about Xero config, explain how it works and show you how to configure it using the web interface of the UCM. As you might already know, Xero config is one of the most important features and applications included in the Grandstream IPPBX UCM 6000. This feature or this application allows UCM administrators to use the web interface of the UCM to manage, provision, and deploy Grandstream devices. Xero config offers intelligent and zero-touch provisioning services for all the Grandstream devices in the local network. Using the plug-and-play functionality provided by Xero config, UCM administrators have the ability to provision Grandstream devices automatically without the need to manually configure each device through the web interface. In fact, Xero config simplifies the phone deployment process by generating XML configuration files for the devices and having the devices to download them through a process that I will explain shortly. So besides the benefits of auto provisioning, Xero config provides the convenience to manage endpoints from one central management interface without having to log in to each phone's web interface. In addition, there are many things that you can do from Xero config, such as upgrading phone firmware, rebooting phones, assigning SIP extensions, launching the phone's web interface, and many other things that we will explore during the live demo. In general, there are 3 steps involved in the provisioning process of Grandstream devices through Xero config on the UCM. The first one is discovering the endpoint devices and adding them to the Xero config list of discovered devices. This process takes place automatically when the device boots up. Users could also manually discover devices using the Discover tool included in the Xero config just by specifying the IP address or the network address. And the second step involves creating configuration presets for specific devices or group of devices using the templates. And the third step is the provision process, which also takes place automatically upon completion of the first 2 steps, or you can choose to start it manually. So now that we explained what Xero config is, so let's understand what happens in the background of the auto provision process through Xero config. So in this example, we'll explore the plug-and-play capability of Xero config and how it works with Grandstream SIP endpoints. Plug-and-play provisioning requires a configuration preset on the UCM. In other words, you need to have the configuration parameters already set up in Xero config. So when you receive the Grandstream endpoint device and you unbox it, you connect it to the network where UCM is located. By default, when you power up the IP phone and it gets assigned an IP address, the IP phone sends a SIP subscribe message to a specific multicast IP address. In that message, the phone includes its own information like the phone model, firmware version, the MAC address, and the IP address. The UCM is pre-configured to listen for traffic on that specific multicast IP address when Xero config is enabled. So when the UCM receives the subscription message from the IP phone, it will fetch the information in the message and display it under the Xero config device configuration list. Then the UCM will reply to the IP phone to inform it that the subscription has been accepted. After that, the UCM will notify the phone of the HTTPS or HTTP URL to use for requesting configuration file. The UCM always uses the URL type configured for the web access. In other words, if you enable HTTP for web access instead of the default HTTPS, the UCM will use the HTTP URL. So upon receiving the configuration URL, the IP phone will acknowledge reception with 200 OK and update its config server path with the new URL provided by the UCM. Then it will initiate an HTTP or HTTPS connection with the UCM to request the config file via HTTP GET using the name of the config file, which includes the local MAC address of the IP phone. The UCM will process the HTTP request for the config file by searching Xero config for an existing configuration that matches the device MAC address. And when it finds that there is a configuration file for that specific IP phone, it will send it through HTTP in an XML format. So when the phone receives the XML config file from the UCM, it will automatically apply the configuration parameters and use the SIP information in the config file to initiate registration to the UCM using the assigned extension. An important thing to keep in mind is that the plug-and-play functionality of Xero config works only with Grandstream devices that are located in the same network as the UCM. Also, Xero config must be enabled on the UCM and should have a configuration preset for the devices you intend to provision. So now that we explained the technical steps involved in the Xero config provisioning, let's go ahead and learn how to configure Xero config using the web interface of the UCM. So when you log into the UCM, Xero config is available in the value added features, Xero config. So as you can see, I have some devices that have already been discovered and configured through Xero config. The Xero config on the UCM automatically discovers IP devices when they boot in the same subnet. In case you have specific device or SIP endpoint that has not been discovered, you can use the auto discover tool built into Xero config. So you have three options in here. You can use the ping method, the ARP method, and the SIP message to discover IP phones. We always recommend using the SIP message because the SIP message carries more information than the ping and the ARP message. So I'm going to show you an example here so you can see the difference between the two. So I have an IP phone in my local network with the IP address ending with 120. So I'm going to discover that one using the ARP method. As you can see, the phone discovers the MAC address and the IP address, but it did not discover the version, the vendor, and the model of the device that the UCM has just discovered. So now let's remove this device and try to discover it again, but this time using the SIP message. So instead of ping, I'm going to choose SIP message. Then I'm going to use the same IP address. So now using the SIP message, you will notice that the UCM or Xero config actually was able to discover the version number, the vendor, and the model. So that's why it's always recommended when trying to discover devices to always use the SIP message, because it provides you with more information about the SIP endpoints trying to get provisioned. So now that you have discovered the device, you can access the configuration parameters of that specific device just by clicking on Edit. And then you have basic settings and advanced settings. Basic settings essentially allows you to configure accounts and VMPKs. Okay, so we can use basic settings to assign an extension to that specific device. So I'm going to give it extension 1021, save, and apply the changes. So now that we assigned extension 1021 to the GXP 2170, one thing or one step that is always required every time that you save changes is you need to go to the update option and you click on the update so that the UCM notifies the phone that there are some changes that the phone needs to request. So assigning extension in Xero config alone is not enough, because when you make changes to Xero config, you're basically generating or creating an XML config file that the phone can use later when you send the notify message. So always remember to click on the update message so that the phone requests the new config file that includes extension 1021. You can also add mini changes to that device. So now that we assigned the extension, we can go to modify custom settings, and then you will have access to many other configuration parameters that you can actually push from Xero config. And some of those parameters include phone settings like dial plan, enable call features, auto answer call info. You can also configure the SIP endpoints using the account settings. You can also configure the VMPKs. So we have line 1 configured with account 1, so I'm going to use, for example, line 2, and I can configure that one with a BLF using account 1 because that's the account that is registered. So in case you would like to monitor extension 1003 with the name of Scott, let me put 1003, save and apply. You can add as many VMPKs through this interface as possible. So I believe this is 2170, so you have up to 48 VMPKs that you can configure through the Xero config. So just for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to configure a couple of them. I'm going to use VMPK2, then I can choose VMPK3, and I can assign its call park, and then I can call that one park 1, and then I can assign the value 701. So basically the information that we enter right here, the description, that's the name that's going to be displayed on the LCD of the phone, and this is the value that the UCM is going to use in the background, which is 701, to park the calls. Save and apply the changes. One thing that you might notice when making your configuration through Xero config is that Xero config does not provide you with all the configuration parameters available through the web interface of the SIP endpoint. But that does not mean that you can push or configure those changes from Xero config. So one way you can do it is, let's look at an example. So I'm connected to a phone right here. This is not the IP, so let's use 192.168. So I'm going to log into the web interface of one of the phones. So let's use this example. You, as the UCM administrator, you have a group of users who are complaining about unsolicited calls or incoming calls, and the source caller ID is most of the time anonymous. So you decide to make changes to the phone so that they can reject incoming calls with source caller ID anonymous. For sure, this option is not available from Xero config. So what you need to do is go to the phone, and for sure I know that this setting is right here, which is anonymous call rejection. By default it's set to no. So what we're trying to do here is change that setting from no to yes. You can do it from the web interface of the phone, but if you have a group of phones, it's always practical and preferable to do it from the Xero config. So to add this option to Xero config, you need to get the P code associated with that setting. The P codes, you can get them from the Grandstream website. So you just go to grandstream.com, go to support, then click on tools, and you look for the configuration templates. Click on it. You're gonna download it. You will need to use a software to unzip the folder, and you look for the template for the model you're trying to provision. In our case is the 2170. So this is the template for the 2170. So this is how the template looks like. It gives you information about the setting and the P code that is associated with that setting. For example, account active by default is set to 1, which is yes. In case you want to deactivate the account, you just change this value to 0. So to look for the P code for the setting that we're interested in, which is the anonymous call rejection. So I'm going to type anonymous call rejection and then filter. And this is the option that we're interested in. So the feature anonymous call rejection has the P code associated with, which is P129. By default it's set to no, which is 0. So what we're trying to do is set that option to yes. So instead of using P129 equals 0, we're going to use P129 equals to 1. And as you know, this setting applies to the first account. GXP has 6 accounts or 6 SIP accounts. So when you do that setting, you're actually going to find 6 settings. So each account is going to have its own P code. So in case you want to do the same thing for the second account, you just move on to the next option. And then you're going to find that the P code associated with the same setting for the SIP account number 2 is P446. So now that we explained how you can download the configuration templates, another way how you can get the P code associated with the setting just using your browser, you right click on the setting, then you go to inspect element. It's going to open an XML configuration like with tags. So you just expand those tags and it's going to give you the P code associated with that setting, which is P129, and the value is set to 0. So as I mentioned earlier, we need to change that setting to 1. Go back to Xero config, and to add those P code values, you use the add new field. So I'm going to put P129, and the value, as we said, is going to be 1, which means yes. And in description, you just give it a name so you remember what that setting is for. So I'm going to call it anonymous. Anonymous call rejection. Save and apply the changes. So when you save and apply the changes, those changes will not be pushed to the phone automatically. So you will need to go to the phone that we just made the changes to and click on the update icon. So when you click on the update icon, the UCM will send a notification to the phone to tell it that there is a configuration file for you, or there is a change in the configuration file for the IP phone, so that the IP phone can request the new configuration files. You can do this one phone at a time, or in case you made changes to so many phones and you would like to update all of them, you can select the phones that you would like to update, and then you can click on update config. So by doing that, the phone will notify all the selected phones with changes in the configuration file. Let me update this page so I can show you something. So under the create config, it always provides a timestamp. The timestamp indicates that the phone actually requested the config file. So this is one of the ways to monitor if the phone actually requested the config file from the UCM. So if you click on update and you don't see the timestamp, that means there is a problem in the provisioning service or the provisioning process. It could be that the phone is unreachable, or something is blocking the provisioning of the new updates. Another nice feature that you can use is the copy feature right here. This one is a nice feature because it allows you to copy one configuration from one phone and copy it to another phone. This is useful especially in cases where you have an existing phone and that phone probably is broken and you got a new phone and you want to copy the configuration to the new phone. That's when this feature comes really handy. So you just choose the source device and the destination device and you click on OK, and the configuration will get copied to the other device. Another option that you can use from Xero Config is the add option. Sometimes you don't have the devices deployed yet, but you want to create configuration presets for these devices. The way you do it is you click on add and then you choose the model and you enter the MAC address. So I'm going to use a fictive one. Okay, so let's give it 7. You don't need to include the IP address, just add the model and the MAC address, and this will allow you to start configuring this device. For example, I just created this one, then I can go to edit and I can start adding all the configuration that I would like to assign to this device. So once you receive that device with this MAC address, what's going to happen, the device upon boot up, it's going to use the same process that we explained earlier to request the configuration from the UCM. When the UCM finds that there is a MAC address associated with the requesting device, the UCM will use that configuration and send it to the phone. And when it does so, it's going to update the information about the IP address using the information in the IP packet. So sometimes instead of making changes to one device at a time using the Xero Config device configuration, you want to make changes and apply them to all the devices or group of devices. This is when Xero Config templates come handy. As you can see, Xero Config supports 4 layers of configuration. There is the device configuration, there is global policy, global templates, and model templates. So before we dive into the configuration of these templates, let's have a quick review how these templates work in Xero Config. So when using Xero Config templates, you will need to take into consideration the Xero Config architecture, which is made of several layers with levels of priority. At the bottom of this priority pyramid, there is global policy template, which can be used to configure some basic options that could apply to all Grandstream devices during the provisioning process, regardless of the model. So every change that you add to global policy will automatically apply to all the devices managed by Xero Config. On top of global policy, there is global template. The main difference between global policy and global template is that global policy applies automatically to all devices once you create one, while global template needs to be selected and applied to devices. In other words, you need to go to the device configuration and select the global template so you can apply it to that device. Users can also create multiple global templates with different sets of configurations and save them and then apply them to the devices. Next, the model templates come second in terms of high priority. They can be used to apply specific configurations to all devices of the same model or apply them to a group of devices of the same model. And last, at the top of the priority pyramid, there is the device settings. Basically, any changes that are made through the device configuration on Xero Config will take priority over all the other templates. Let's look at this example to help us understand the priority architecture. For instance, if a user has a global policy with the login password set to password and the selected model template with a different login password, in our case it's secret, then later you decide to assign a unique admin password for a specific user who wants to access the web UI of the phone. And to do that, you go to device settings of Xero config and change the password of that phone. In this example, you will end up with 3 conflicting values for the same setting, which is the login password. In this case, Xero config will apply the login password admin on the device because the device settings have higher priority than model templates and global policy. Just to summarize, configurations in higher layer will always override the configurations for the same options in the lower layer when presented at the same time. So now let's go back to the web interface of the UCM and do some configurations to the templates. So for this tutorial video, I'm going to use global policy to change the login password for the admin. And this is one of the common things that administrators should use is when they receive devices, they should always change the login password so that users don't log into the IP phones and start making changes. So I'm going to change that one to a new password, save and apply. So with the global policy, as I mentioned earlier, every change that you made to global policy will apply automatically to all the devices managed through Xero config. Next, I'm going to go to global templates, and we can use it, for example, to create a firmware upgrade template. So we're going to call it the firmware files. And description, we can say, for example, this is for GXVs and GXP IP phones. And make sure you set that one to active, so when you go to the device configuration, you will have it available as an option. So I'm going to save and apply this option. Then the firmware upgrade information is available under the maintenance menu. So if you go to the firmware source, the UCM gives you 4 options that you can use to upgrade SIP endpoints from Xero config. You can use the URL, in other words, you configure the URL and then you push that URL to the phones so that the phones can use that URL to request the firmware file. This is useful in case you would like to use the Grandstream website to upgrade certain phone models. You can change that information, for example, to firmware.grandstream.com and send that information to all the phones so that they can use that link to upload the latest firmware updates. The other options that you can use is you can use the local UCM internal storage, and you can add the firmware files just by clicking on the storage manager, and then you can start uploading the binary files. I don't recommend using the internal storage of the UCM because you want to save that one for other stuff like call recording, voicemails, and all the other information that uses the internal storage of the UCM. What I would usually recommend is use an external drive like a USB drive or an SD card where you can upload your firmware files to the folder in the USB drive. The UCM gives you some information here mentioning that the external drive needs to have a directory with the name ZC_firmware. So what you need to do is just copy that information and then go to your directory, and before you plug the external drive to the UCM, make sure you first of all make sure you upload the firmware files using your computer. So this is a USB drive that I have. I'm going to create a new folder, and the folder must have the name of ZC firmware. So now that I created the folder, now I need to upload firmware files to it. And the way you can do it, so I'm going to go to my desktop because I know I have a firmware file that I uploaded earlier. Or I can just go here and then copy and go back to USB drive, to the main folder, and paste that firmware file. The firmware file should be the binary file, because when you download the firmware file from the Grandstream website, it's actually in a zipped format. So make sure you get the .bin format in the root directory folder with the name ZC firmware. So once you do that, you can just go take the USB drive and plug it into the UCM and save and apply changes. So now that you created the global template, the way you assign it to the device, you just go and you select, for example, one device. Let's say I'm going to use the GXV3240 or GXV2170. I can select that one, for example. Then you just go to Advanced Settings, scroll down until you see Global Templates, and then you will see the template that we just created available. So you can just select that one and add that information to the configuration of that specific device. If you have multiple global templates, you're going to have all of them available here, and then you can choose which one to apply to that specific device. So I'm going to save that information. Remember, saving information that does not mean that the phone is already being provisioned. Every time you save the information, you need to come back here and click on Update so that the UCM can notify the IP phone that there is a change in the configuration. Next, let's go to a model template. I already have a template here, so let's create another one. Let's say this is for GXB2170. And I'm going to call that one, for example, BLFs. So you have multiple phones and all of them, they want to have the same, or we can call it call park, for example. And you want to configure all of them with call park buttons so that users can use them to park and unpark calls. So I'm going to give it that name, then we're going to go to phone. And for example, you can choose VMPK4 and you can assign it call park 1. You can call that one, for example, park 1. And by default, the UCM uses the call park extension 701. You can add another call park and you can call it park 2. And you can assign it the value 702, which is the second call park extension lot. Save and apply this template. One thing that you're going to notice when I was creating this template is that it gives you two options, active and default model template. So when they check the active, that means the model template, let's go to one of the GXP phones so I can show you. So when the model template is set to active, you allow it to be available under advanced settings, so you can choose that model template and apply it manually to your devices. Save and apply. However, when you have the model templates configured or set as default model template, this configuration will apply automatically to all the Grandstream. For example, here we have it set up for GRP 2614. So every time you have a phone that is managed from Xero config and it belongs to the model GRP 2614, the Xero config will push those changes automatically to the phone. So you don't have to go to each phone and make these changes manually. It's very important to remember that you can only have one default model template. So make sure you select the one that you would like it to apply automatically to all the phones. I want to show you something else here. Suppose I would like to create a new model template for let's say you received phones which belongs to the model GRP 2612P, and when you come to the model template you don't see the 2612P, you only see 2612. This indicates that the model template or the template for that specific model is not downloaded yet. To do that, you need to go to Model Update and look for the model that you're looking for, which is 2612p, and you will notice that it has not been downloaded yet. So when you don't see a template available in the model template or device configuration, you can always come to Model Update and download the template for the phone you're looking for. And one thing that you should know about the model update is that it requires internet connection. So when I clicked on download, the UCM actually is requesting the template file from the Grandstream server. So if you don't have internet connection or the UCM is not connected to the internet, you're not going to be able to see that list right here, and you're not going to be able to download the templates for the devices you intend to provision. Next, we move to Xero config settings. So this is the default setting of Xero config. You only have Xero config enabled, plus you have some other information right here at the bottom. Let's talk about these for a second. Enable Xero config. So when Xero config is used in your provision, it's enabled by default, so you don't have to do anything. But in case you want to provision your phones manually and you don't want to use Xero config, please come back here and remove or uncheck this box. This way you don't have conflicting settings like manual changes on the phone and Xero config. But we always recommend using Xero config when you have phones deployed in the same network. The second option that we have here is called Enable Automatic Configuration Assignment. This is a very nice and very useful feature. So when you have this option checked, and let's say, for example, you have a model template configured as default model template, every time there is a new phone that you connect to your network, the UCM will provision the phones with the information in the default model template. So that's like plug and play. So the UCM, you don't need to add the device to the Xero config to provision it, but once you have this checked and you have default model templates or global policy templates configured, that information will be provisioned automatically to the devices upon rebooting. There is also this option right here that we call auto assign extension. You noticed earlier during the Xero config that we can assign extensions to one device at a time. In case you don't care about what extensions you're going to assign to each device, you can use this option, which is useful. It's called auto assign extension. And when you have that option checked together with this option, every time there is a Grandstream IP phone that connects to your network, the UCM will assign it an extension automatically. The default range is from 5,000 to 6,299. You can always click on that setting right here, so you can change that range to a range of extensions that you would like to apply. Next, I would like to talk about the subnet list or subnet whitelist. So before I explain what subnet whitelist does, let's look at an example here to help us understand better what this feature can be used for. So this is a network topology made of 3 VLANs. The UCM is deployed in the voice VLAN, and then we have some other Grandstream devices deployed in the Wi-Fi VLAN and a couple of devices in the surveillance VLAN. So when one of these devices on the remote VLANs tries to request provisioning from the Xero config, the UCM will reject that request because the UCM by default is configured to accept requests from devices in the same subnet or in the same VLAN. So the solution to that one is whitelist or subnet whitelist. So to allow devices from the Wi-Fi VLAN and surveillance VLAN to request configuration from the UCM, you will need to add the network address to the subnet whitelist on the UCM. So in our case, we're going to add 10.10.20 and 10.10.30.0 for the other 2 VLANs. So when you do that, what's going to happen when the remote devices request configuration from the UCM will honor these requests, will fetch the information, look for the configuration file, and replies back to the devices in the remote VLANs. So you can add multiple VLANs right here, so that devices from other VLANs can get provisioned using Xero config. And one thing, when you add devices, or when you add network addresses to the subnet whitelist, it allows you to discover devices on the remote VLAN. So if you click right here using the ping, it's not going to show you the remote subnets. So you need to use the SIP message, so you will have access to the remote subnets, so you can discover devices remotely. So let's say you want to discover devices on VLAN 10.10.30.0. You just enter the IP address, click OK, then the UCM will discover devices on the other VLANs. Remember, you need to add devices to the whitelist so you can detect them or discover them using the SIP message from Xero config. There are a few other settings on the Grandstream IP devices that I would like to talk about quickly. So earlier at the beginning of this presentation, we talked about the plug and play and how the phone sends the SIP subscribe message upon rebooting. That behavior is actually possible because we have that option set to yes. So in case you don't want the phones to send SIP subscribe message upon rebooting, you can check that one and you set it to no. So when you set that one to no, the phones will not try to subscribe to the UCM. This option, you can also push it from Xero config. One thing that you should avoid if you are using Xero config, you definitely want to have that one set to yes. So don't set that one to no. Even if it has a different name here, it does not indicate that you can use it with a third-party IP PBX, but this is the option that allows the phones to automatically discover the UCM upon rebooting. So it's very important to keep that one set to yes. Another option that I would like to talk about is user protection. And this option is useful in such case where the UCM admin makes changes through Xero config, then the users, they go through the web interface of the phone and they make their own changes. Let's say they change the display caller ID, they change the BLFs, so they change information. So what happens, sometimes you end up with conflicting values for the same option. And with that option set to off, what's going to happen if the phone reboots and requested the configuration from the UCM, the parameters sent by the UCM will override whatever changes were made manually using the web interface of the phone. If you would like to prioritize the stuff that was made manually on the phone so that it can override the changes that are sent by Xero config, make sure you set that one to on. So when you have that one to on, any changes, any conflicting changes, always the ones that were made manually on the phone will override the UCM or the Xero config provisioning parameters.
We hope that you found that video tutorial helpful, and if you did, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for the latest in video tutorials. I'm Nathan Sharp. You have a good one.